bride was sent to the wrong territory. Two small children whispered, "God finally sent you here." The stage jerked once and went still, leather thoroughbraces sighing as if a tired animal had lain down to sleep. Wind came out of the medicine bow like a saw, raking the yard with hard snow that stung skin through wool. Wyoming Territory, late November 1888. Sky the color of pewter, ground white as bone. The road a single gray seam knotted with drifts. Eliza Rowan climbed down with a trunk that had learned every mile of her hunger, boots ringing the iron step, gloved fingers numb, bonnet string worrying her throat raw. The letter in her bodice named Cottonwood Crossing, a grey house with a painted porch swing, a bookkeeper's widower, who signed himself Thaddeus Pike, with a schoolteacher's hand. This house was not grey, and there was no swing-only log and plank mended with adobe, smoke furling thin from a stovepipe, a windmill ticking a high, patient note as if counting the gusts. A tall man stood in the lean-to glow where a forge threw orange light across an anvil face bright as river stone. He neither smiled nor scowled. He only watched like a seasoned hand gauges weather on a horse's ear. Before he spoke, two small shapes darted from the porch, coats patched, boots too big, hands linked to keep courage from coming apart. They stopped close enough to feel Eliza's breath lift and fall, and in a single shared hush both whispered, as if saying grace too dear for a table, "God finally sent you here." The wind seemed to bow and pass on. The man stepped forward then, palm empty, voice low from long days saved for work. "Name?" "Eliza Rowan," she answered, steady by stubbornness alone. "I was sent to Red Willow Ranch, Mr. Pike's, as wife by agreement." The man's jaw set, not unkindly. "This is the Boone place," he said. "Isaac Boone. No Pike here." The driver tipped his hat and said they'd lose the pass if they dallied. Wheels bit, hooves struck sparks, and the coach went away swallowing the only easy choice. Eliza drew the letter, felt the clerk's wrong notch on a county line, the directions that split at a cottonwood which, in flood, pointed both to water and away from it. She had walked too far inside the arithmetic of survival to faint now. Behind Isaac, the forge breathed like a tired animal. In the snow-bitter air hung iron, coal, and horse, the honest smells that mean work. He did not ask more. He weighed sky, wind, and the minute tremor in Eliza's gloved hand, then opened the door. Heat rolled out like mercy. "You'll warm till morning," he said. "We'll untangle paper in daylight." The children, Lucy with her ribbon made from an old hem, and Abe, whose mittens were pieced from a feed sack, stood aside solemn as deacons. Eliza crossed the threshold and set her trunk down by feel rather than hope. The stove ticked. The room held quiet the way a church holds it after bad news. On a peg hung a shawl, gray and neatly folded, the kind of careful folding that says a name no longer spoken. Isaac shut the door softly, the way a careful man does when the past sleeps light. Eliza did not ask for promise. She asked the stove for breath. Outside, wind wrote its blunt scripture on the yard. Inside, a stranger chose kindness first and questions later. It was the winter after the great die-up, when cattle bones freckled the flats and ranchers mended more than fences. Wyoming Territory, 1888, a year when men measured hope in salt pork and lamp oil. The Boone place sat in a shallow cup of land, shelter enough for a house of split pine and adobe, a sod roof under fresh-shaved shakes, a windmill creaking a small hymn above a plank well. A sheet-iron cook-stove shouldered the north wall, blacked to a shine, warming shelf crowded with a bean pot gone soft at the edges, a round of sourdough wrapped in tow, a tin of Arbuckle coffee like a promise kept in the corner. A broom hung bristles up to cheat mice. A water crock wore a damp cloth against dust. Along the rafters strings of dried apples and twist tobacco made their own quiet company. On another peg, beside a boy's slouch hat and a girl's bonnet, hung a leather belt, cut short, square buckle polished by a thumb that was not a child's. Eliza took the room in with that quick ledger a traveling woman keeps. Her dress was good brown wool, hem darned fine as lace where plank splinters had tried their meanness. Boots resoled by a hand that respected leather. Shawl thin, but clean. In her trunk, A Bible with her mother's maiden name in a careful copper plate, 2 needles in paper, a small blue crock of lard wrapped against breakage, a folded calico apron, and the letter that had turned wrong at the county seat like any river that loses patience with its banks. She smelled lye soap and iron, and the faint sweet of cured pignon. The stove breathed, the house listened. Grief lived here, but it minded its manners. Isaac Boone moved with the thrift of a man who built what he needed and asked little more of the day. He fed the fire with split cedar, set a kettle, and did not fill the room with words that would have to be taken back. He wore a shirt washed near to thread, a leather apron thrown on a chair from the forge, and on his hand, the pale ghost where a ring had once held its ground. Lucy stood with her braid stubborn and her chin proud the way 6-year-olds practice when they think no one sees. Abe hovered behind a chair, eyes watchful, the way 4-year-olds learn when the world has already educated them beyond their size. Eliza's glance fell to the shawl on the peg. She didn't ask whose. A careful fold is an answer with edges. The stove set its quiet. The wind outside tested the chinking and found its sound. Isaac set 3 tin plates and a 4th small as a favor, ladled beans, tore cornbread, slid the larger piece toward the stranger without looking. Eat was all the ceremony he offered. It was enough. Eliza's body remembered hunger faster than pride. She let warmth reach fingers, then wrists, then the small, aching bones of her forearms, and only then let her shoulders drop the inch that lives between danger and maybe not. After, when Lucy's ribbon came loose and burrs showed their teeth, Eliza asked, "May I?" Lucy tilted her head with a queen's permission. Eliza worked the snags with a calm patience learned at washboards and sickbeds. Abe studied her hands, then placed on the table a wooden horse carved from a spool and mended with pegs. "Fine work," Eliza said, as if to a man, and Abe's back straightened, as if thanked by a badge. Night folded itself over the house. Isaac took his hat and said the bunkhouse would suit him. His boots crossed the porch slow and sure. Eliza laid her shawl near the stove and made the narrow bed in the alcove, quilt of shirts and feed sack flowers warm with the day's breath. She did not borrow more than the house offered. A woman who has come this far learns to leave no mark that cannot be carried away at dawn. And yet, the way Lucy's hand brushed her skirt as she passed, the way Abe set his spool horse by the alcove as if to stand guard, some small claim had been staked without paperwork. Outside, the wind rehearsed tomorrow's trouble. Inside, 4 lives chose a truce. Morning slid in thin and silver, frost rhyming the porch basin, the windmill turning slow as a church fan. Isaac had been to the forge before first light. Bellows breathed, iron answered clean, a horseshoe cooled on the sill faintly steaming like a ghost with decent manners. Eliza rose into the house's rhythm, no clatter, no waste. She measured coffee with a steady spoon, trimmed the lamp wick square, set the skillet, checked the damper, and folded the towel to dry where heat would finish what hands began. Lucy patted in on sock feet, hair still tidy from last night's braid. Abe followed with his toy horse like a deputy trailing an older law. "Your floorboards run true," Eliza said to no one, which in some houses is the same as praise. Isaac came in with the smell of iron and cold and hoarse. He kept his hat in his hand like a man doing sums. "There's a red willow east and a red willow west," he said at last, and the county clerk lost his religion over which is which. The ghost of a smile then gone. "Pike's place sits 2 ridges south, not this one. A mistake could be a wound if left untended." Eliza nodded once, folded the letter by its old crease, and said, not like boasting but as inventory, "I keep accounts straight, read deeds without blinking, sew flesh or cloth and know when a calf's gone wrong in a drift. I don't break easy." Isaac lifted the kettle lid a half-inch to let steam think. Small gestures are the largest in a house that minds quiet. The day arranged itself without fuss. Isaac would ride the bay, McClellan's saddle cinched honest, take the arroyo cut where willows mark a hidden run, and ask after a porch swing and a bookkeeper's widow. Eliza would keep the fire true, shake rugs against the wind's opinions, boil the dishcloth in lye, beat the mattress tick, and teach Lucy to stitch small sew-mending looks like tomorrow, not yesterday. Abe would be set to kindling and kept away from tools, except the ones he could name. If the yearling tried the fence again, she would rattle a pan and put shame in it. Before he went, Isaac led the bay up, let the gelding blow on Eliza's sleeve, took the animal's measure by the way it chose to trust her scent. "He's sound," she said. "So is the day, if a person minds it." The tiniest tilt of his head, necessary, set to hold. Eliza put the house right the way a woman does when no one is watching, but everyone will feel the difference. Sand on the table, lye where grease argued, the broom whispering grain to grain, the stove fed when it asked, and not before. She found the hinge that wanted tallow, the peg that would be happier one finger to the left, the loose rung that would squeak complaints unless taught manners by a wedge. Lucy practiced letters on a flour sack. L for Lucy, R for Rowan, while Abe drew corrals in dust and drove pebble cattle from shade to sun and back. Eliza set beans to simmer, tucked a heel of bread into a damp cloth on the warming shelf, and mended the left cuff of a shirt with a patience that made the needle sleep in her fingers. Isaac returned when the sun had turned from iron to tin. He unsaddled, watered the bay in measured sips, and hung the bridle where leather remembers shape. "Pike exists," he said at the door. "He expects a wife that knows figures and keeps counsel. His porch faces east, and his temper may be the same. Not a warning, not quite. 2 towns between here and there, and a sky that holds snow if given excuse." They ate in a quiet that didn't scrape. After, he set a little ledger on the table and nudged it with a forefinger toward Eliza without asking. She ran columns twice, carried a 10 where a 9 had been proud, and set the numbers down square as fence corners. Something eased in his shoulders, the kind of easing a man doesn't notice until later when the lamp is down and the house chooses sleep. Trust did not arrive with trumpets. It edged in like heat from an oven door left a finger's breadth ajar. Lucy put her doll in Eliza's lap without ceremony. Abe leaned his shoulder against Eliza's skirt as if testing a wall. Isaac hung his scarf on the peg nearest the door and left it there, which in some countries is a declaration. Outside, wind rehearsed accusations it would one day bring to town. Inside, 4 people made a small, workable peace under one roof, with no promises, only actions, and the night approved by staying quiet. Morning brought a blue so hard the snow squeaked underfoot. Ada walked the children to the mercantile for needles and salt, her shawl pinned with a bone button, Gideon working the forge in a halo of sparks back in town. Gossip moves faster than water. 2 women by the flour bin glanced over and then away, all sympathy polished off into curiosity. "New help?" Mrs. Harlan asked. "For Gideon?" "Help," the other said, and let the word sit like a stain. The storekeeper's wife smiled without showing teeth. "Mind you don't charge calico if you haven't got credit." Ada counted exact coins and kept her hands still. At church on Sunday, the Reverend prayed long against idleness and the temptations of winter, and Ada could feel every eye on the back of her shawl like sleet. Gideon sat 2 pews behind, hat in his lap, gaze fixed on the hymn book he did not open. He was a reserved man, and reserve has edges. When Deputy Voss stopped in at the yard, badge bright as a spoon, and said, "Pike claims there's more paper," Gideon wiped his hands on canvas and only said, "He was paid." Voss looked past him at Ada, stepping from the wagon. A woman's place is clear when papers say it. The deputy's tone was not a threat. It was a habit. Ada smiled at him with no warmth at all and walked the children inside. That night, with the lamp turned low, she watched the shadow of Gideon's shoulders pass the window as he crossed from bunkhouse to woodpile and back again, a distance measured in more than yards. The table was wiped clean, the bread wrapped, Jessie's whistle laid neat beside a tin cup. She understood charity not to mean belonging. It meant, For now, a roof and a stove and boots mended well enough to keep walking when the time came. On Tuesday, Eva came home with hay chaff in her braid and a tightness around her mouth that was older than her 7 years. "A boy said we don't live nowhere proper," she murmured, eyes on the floorboards. Jesse had a tear in his coat, where some sharper child had pulled it. The schoolmarm, thin, righteous, had sent a note suggesting that domestic irregularity is a confusion for little ones. Ada folded the paper once, then again, and set it under the pepper tin. At the well, a neighbor woman reached for the bucket at the same time, and then decided she was not thirsty. In the mercantile, when Ada asked for a handful of coffee, the clerk made a long business of measuring. You could hear feeling shift in a town, the slight step back, the "we'll see," the way men told jokes softer when you came near. That night, Eva took off her mittens and looked at Ada with a careful face. "Do we have to go?" she asked. Ada smoothed the braid, listening to the stove breathe, to the low talk of cattle in the dark, to Gideon's boots on the porch. "We stay where we're wanted," she said after a moment. When Gideon came in, he put a small flour sack on the table and did not look at them as he said, "Day's work at Harkness's. He paid in beans." He left a scarf on the peg by the door, a wool thing of a quiet brown, newer than anything Ada owned. "Weather turns tonight," he added, and though he spoke to the air, the words found her. Later, tucking in Jessie, she considered the road in her head, its mileposts and a hunger that would wake them before dawn. Pride is bread that fills you, but leaves you empty. She lay a hand over the boy's chest and waited for sleep to argue her down. The cold returned fierce and sudden, a blue norther that dropped out of the Horse Creek breaks like a thrown axe. By afternoon the light went pewter, and the air turned to needles. Isaac went to check the south fence where last blow had scoured drift against wire. Eliza banked the stove and mended a seam. When the first ghost snow walked sideways across the yard, she called the children from the porch. Lucy came, Abe came, then the yearling bawled from the lower pasture, a thin, foolish sound. Lucy's eyes flicked to the door. "Stay," Eliza said, gentling the word so it wouldn't bruise. The latch clicked once in answer. Wind pressed it open a finger's width. In the next breath, Lucy was gone, ribbon flashing like a bluebird wing into white. Eliza hit the peg for her shawl, snatched a lantern, and looped a lariat around her waist, the way cowhands do when they mistrust the ground. She tied the line off to the porch post, tested it, and stepped into the gray. The yard vanished to the length of her arm. The wind took her breath, and then returned it as a bargain. "Lucy!" she called, the name torn to rags and flung back. She counted steps, 10, 12, paid out rope, counted again. The lantern threw a small egg of light that moved like a ship in heavy water. At the corral, a dark gap where snow had slabbed and fallen. Beyond, willows made a black comb against the wind. She found tracks already filling, small as a bird's. The creek cut had skinned over with a sugar ice that lies even to careful men. Lucy had slid down the bank on her knees, hands splayed, breath making wild flowers on the air. Eliza crawled the last yards, laying her weight long, lantern on its side to spread light. "We go back now," she said, voice low as soup. Lucy did not answer. Her teeth chattered in a rhythm of terror and resolve. Something moved in the willows. 2 coyotes, ribs like drawn bows, smart enough to circle fear. Eliza set the lantern high and flung her shawl wide, making herself the largest truth in that place. She picked a stone from the bank and threw. It struck close. The animals reconsidered hunger and left for easier arithmetic. A shape resolved ahead. Isaac, hat rim iced, eyes wide the way men's eyes get when they meet a world that could have gone otherwise. He took the rope, took Lucy, took in Eliza's shaking and made no comment that would spend either of them. Back in the house, he fed the stove, like a man tithing, wrapped warm stones in flannel, slipped them by Lucy's feet, lifted the girl's hands to his mouth, and breathed heat into little stiff fingers. Eliza stripped her own wet sleeves and rubbed heat along Lucy's arms in long, sure strokes that tell a body it is not done. When color returned and the chatter slowed to a dented rhythm, Isaac's control, worked like leather until it seems a part of a man, cracked the width of a barley straw. He reached across the quilt and closed his hand over Eliza's, work rough to work rough, and lowered his head as if the act required prayer. "Had you not been here," he said, and then failed at the rest, because some sums are too large to finish aloud. The room understood. Lucy slept with Eliza's shawl under her cheek. Abe settled his spool horse on the sill to guard the window. Outside, the wind chose another place to be unkind. Inside, what began as accident turned to proof, and Eliza felt that small shift in a house when it starts to call someone by their first name even when no one speaks. Wind eased by morning, the world bleached and clean as bone. The house smelled of coffee and wet wool drying near the stove, and Lucy's ribbon, rescued, washed, retied, hung from the peg as if a small flag had found its country. Isaac said little, but his silence had turned from distance to shelter. It moved around the room like a man laying his coat over a sleeping child. Eliza set to the day with a steadiness that did not announce itself. She blued the linens, rubbed the iron smooth with a candle stub, stitched the pocket of Isaac's Sunday shirt so the ledger pencil would sit straight and not fall into the churn of chores. When the kettle sang, Lucy slipped her hand into Eliza's without thinking. Abe placed his spool horse on the table like an extra setting and waited to see if anyone would argue. No one did. Small things stitched the hours. Isaac brought in a length of cottonwood board, planed it true at the ends, and asked, with a careful tone that did not wish to put weight on her, if she had ever sat a porch swing. "I have mended one," she said, which was an answer he understood. He squared the joints, drilled clean, set pegs he'd whittled by lamplight and sanded until the grain answered with its own quiet. She cut bits of calico into small stars and appliqued them to dishcloth edges she'd hemmed double, then hung them like a promise of cleanliness that outlasts weather. Lucy learned to set a teacup down without making the saucer complain. Abe learned the names of tools as if reciting the catechism. Draw knife, brace, bit. They ate early and worked late. Isaac's hand once rested on Eliza's as they both reached for the tin lid, the contact no longer a flinch but a finding. Her scarf, the thin brown one, appeared by accident on the back of his chair. He folded it, left it on the peg nearest the stove so it would hold warmth for her. In the evening, he showed her the ridge trail on a map he'd drawn in graphite and sweat, and where snow lay in lee of cut banks, and where the creek lied about its depth when the moon fell wrong. She listened the way a woman listens who plans to carry a family's safety in her head. There was laughter, thin as sunlight, but true. Lucy told how the schoolroom mouse had learned letters faster than Walt Vail. Abe tried to whistle and produced a sound like a kettle in a hurry. Isaac shook his head and made a near smile, and then went to oil the hinge that had begun to complain again, because the house should not have to speak what mouths can carry. When Eliza banked the fire that night, Isaac paused in the doorway to the bunkhouse and spoke as if testing a bridge he meant to cross. "You will not leave because town is unkind," he said. It was not a command. It was a request disguised as fact. "I will not leave because they are unkind," she answered. "Only if leaving keeps your children whole." He nodded once. He did not sleep easily after that, and the lamp burned later than usual. Midweek, the wind came round, and with it, men who liked to set weather to their purposes. Harlan Finch rode in with 2 McCrae hands, a roll of papers tied with red twine like a holiday that had taken a wrong turn. He dismounted slow, law the way a scarecrow is a man, right shapes, wrong soul. On the yard he read from the top sheet where a clerk's ink had worked harder than truth. Notice to quit, for arrears on grazing fees, and for maintaining an improper household, to the injury of minor children and the scandal of the territory. He glanced over the page with a mouth that knew how to sneer without moving. Mrs. Vale stood at the gate, shawl thorn-pinned, to serve as chorus. Isaac took the paper with a blacksmith's fingers and held it to the light as if a forgery might confess in the sun. "Fees were paid in October," he said, level. Eliza had the proof before he asked. She set Mr. Ketchum's stamped receipt beside the notice on the porch rail, the way one sets a good blade beside a poor one to let anyone with eyes see the difference. Finch did not look. "There is also the matter," he said, "of a contracted husband down at the other Red Willow waiting in moral distress." He tipped his hat toward Eliza, as if she were a bad child. "You'll ride with me now, Miss Rowan." Lucy's breath caught. Abe's fist closed around the leg of Eliza's skirt. Eliza stood straight, the gray shawl on her shoulders not as armor, but as ownership. "I am not chattel to be fetched by clerks and small men," she said, and her voice had the clean edge of a whetstone. "The contract misdelivered is no contract until I consent, and I have not. As for the household," she set her palm on Lucy's crown, then on Abe's shoulder. "These children are tended, fed, warm, and loved. If scandal trouble you, turn your eyes." Finch moved to push past Isaac. He found himself stopped by a hand that did not shake. "You'll not cross this threshold under color of ink you know is false," Isaac said softly, which is how a man speaks when the next words could be louder and costlier. Mrs. Vale tisked and began to gather a crowd from the road because crowds are currency. Harlan named the day, Saturday, when he would return with the sheriff proper and remove improper persons and attach property. He left the notice nailed at the gate where the wind could read it. The McCrae hands dropped a match as they turned. It died on snow but told the truth of their plan. After they rode off, the house exhaled with them. Eliza took the notice down and set it under a plate so it could not blow its poison into the yard. She sat at the table with Isaac and laid the receipts in a line: grazing, taxes, feed. "They are buying law with rumor," she said. Isaac rubbed his brow with 2 fingers. "They want the water and my south pasture," he answered, "and they think a winter wind will do the rest." Eliza rose, walked to the peg, and took down the shawl. "Then we will make our wind," she said. She filled buckets, set a barrel by the hay, soaked sacks, laid axes and hooks where a hand could find them in panic, and taught Lucy and Abe a simple rule: if fire speaks, water must answer fast, and many. At dusk, a buggy rattled in from the south road, a decent gray horse in the traces, and a man with a clerk's spine on the seat. Thaddeus Pike bowed without flourish and removed his hat like respect costs nothing. He spoke kindly to Lucy, tipped his head to Abe, and addressed Eliza with a care that made even refusal feel costly. "I have come to take you to the life we planned, Miss Rowan," he said. She stood in the doorway she had rescued the night before last from blown snow and small deaths, and met steadiness with steadiness. "We never met," she said, "and plans made on lost paper belong to the wind. I wish you peace." Mr. Pike looked from her to Isaac, read more than either would have said, and bowed again. "Then may the Lord set you where you are meant," he answered, and took his decent gray horse home, and the dust that rose behind his wheels contained no malice. The crowd thinned. The sky did not. Saturday came, shouldering a dry wind that made splinters mean. Before noon, Finch returned with 2 more hands, and the McCraes rode behind like men who enjoy someone else's trouble. Word had done its worst. The road filled with townsfolk, Ketchum with his apron still on, Mrs. Vale sharp as vinegar, Miss Hayes with chalk dust on her cuffs, Walt Vale smirking until his mother's hand stilled him. Finch swung down and showed the folded writ like a cheap trick. "By order," he began. He did not finish. A curl of smoke lifted from the hayrick beyond the corral, first slim as a churchwoman's ribbon, then bright and climbing. One McCrae hand stood with a coal oil can he had forgotten to hide. The wind, eager to make itself useful, took the flame and ran it along dry stalks like a boy draws a line with a stick. Eliza did not scream. Screaming is for later. She seized the soaked sacks, thrust one into Lucy's arms, another into Abe's small fists, and ran. Isaac hauled the barrel onto a sledge, flipped it, and sent water into the straw's throat. "Line!" Eliza shouted, voice clean as orders in a field hospital. "From the pump to the rick, fast and many." Ketchum stepped without thinking. Mr. Vale, despite his wife's pinched mouth, found himself shoulder to shoulder with Isaac. Even Miss Hayes fetched and carried, because whatever she thought of propriety, she knew arithmetic. Hay burns slower if water argues. Finch hesitated the way small men do when events refuse to follow paper. He barked at his hands to hold the crowd back. The crowd did not. Eliza climbed the stack's side on knees and will, beat at flame with a wet sack until sparks bit her wrists and singed her braid. Isaac came up the other side and dragged a burning fork down before the wind could take it into the barn roof. A cinder landed on Abe's sleeve. Lucy slapped it out with the flat of her hand, and then looked surprised at her own bravery. The coal oil can clanged where it fell. Ketchum put his boot on it and looked level at Finch. "You serving attachment," he said, "or arson?" The deputy's mouth worked, but made nothing useful. The crowd watched him like a jury that has already voted. By the time the smoke flattened and turned sweet with wet hay, Eliza's hands shook, and the skin at her wrist had blistered to a tidy oval. Isaac took her arm in both hands, not as a claim, but as a man steadies something he values. He turned to the road and faced law in name with the only authority the territory ever truly respects. A person who stands where they intend to live. "You aim to take this place by ink and by fire," he said to Finch. "You aim to take these children by gossip." He lifted Eliza's palm, the one that had beaten flame off the hay that would have fed those same children, so all could see. "This house stands because of her. If there is scandal, it is men who cannot read receipts and who drop matches where families sleep." No one spoke, not even Mrs. Vale. Thaddeus Pike was not there to see it, but his kind of decency stood in Ketchum's shoulders when the storekeep nodded once and said, "Fees paid." He tapped the stamped paper with 2 fingers. Any attachment today is humbug. The McCrae hands shifted, caught between wages and weather and the way a crowd can turn. Finch gathered what dignity he could fold, stuffed the false writ into his coat, and stepped back. He tipped his hat to no one and left. The road breathed out. Eliza stood very straight in the yard, a wet sack dripping at her boots, hair damp with steam and sweat. Isaac did not touch her cheek because 100 eyes were on her, but his eyes did the touching for him. Evening came soft, as if it had understood the day's appetite for mercy. The wind lay down. The long light turned the yard to a shallow lake of gold. The stove ticked in satisfaction at its own good work. Isaac disappeared to the lean-to and returned with the cottonwood swing finished true, sanded so the grain felt like a river remembered, the chains oiled so they would speak in low notes, not squeal. He set the posts, sank the footing square, and motioned with the lightest tilt of his chin. Eliza sat. Lucy climbed in beside her. Abe took the other side and counted the creaks like a hymn. Isaac went inside and brought out a small box of pine, carved with a star and a willow branch. "I had a ring once," he said to Eliza, voice careful as if touching a wound, "and it honored what was. I have nothing fine now, only what hands can make." He opened the box. Inside lay a simple band he had hammered from an old silver spoon, the bowl cut, the handle bent, the metal polished until it remembered light. He did not kneel. This country raises few men who kneel for anything but work and prayer. He stood solid on his own ground and offered what he had. "I choose you," he said, simple as fact. "If you'll choose us." Eliza did not trust her voice. The day had spent most of her words. She slipped the ring on. It fit like something that had known her finger longer than she had. "I will stay," she said at last. "I will keep accounts, mend, fetch, fight, and be the last thing the night sees cross this yard when trouble comes. And I will meet you at the door when the day is honest, and our hands are empty of tools." Isaac's breath left him the way it does when a man reaches the top of a ridge and sees not a fence, but a valley. Lucy leaned forward so hard the swing tipped, pressed her cheek to Eliza's sleeve, and whispered with the authority of one who has already decided, "Mama." Abe did not say the word. He laid his spool horse on Eliza's lap and then, shy of his own courage, looked away. It was enough. Smoke rose steady from the stovepipe. The yard smelled faintly of wet hay and iron and coffee. The gray shawl hung on its peg, still folded careful, a name honored, not erased. Eliza tied her brown scarf over it so two threads would keep watch together. The chains of the new swing spoke in low music as the last light dropped behind the windmill. On the table inside, the stamped receipts lay in order, the false notice under a plate, the ledger open to a clean page. The window held the reflection of a family seated on a swing, 3 silhouettes and a fourth, who stood as if he could hold up the sky if it came loose. Night settled without argument. The wind, having spent itself on lesser tasks, left the house to its own. In the quiet, Eliza heard the frontier's oldest vow, no grand speeches, only the repetition of ordinary care, water carried, wood split, bread cut in even shares, a hand at her back when steps were tricky. Love here was not a blaze, but a banked fire that survives weather and feeds days. When the lamp went down, the last thing to move was the swing, a slow arc, as if time itself had learned to be gentle. Sometimes the map is wrong on purpose. It takes a winter, a rope, and a child's whisper to prove that the right home isn't a place you find on paper. It's the one you build with your hands when the wind is cruel. Eliza Rowan stepped off a stage into the wrong territory, and a town tried to name her mistake. But love out here is a working verb. A wet sack thrown against flame, a ledger balanced in lamplight, a shawl spread wide over a frightened girl, a ring hammered from a silver spoon because metal and people can be remade. If this story found you, if you felt the snow, the smoke, and the quiet promise of a home earned, stay with us. Subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another tale from the heart of the Wild West.